Confusion regarding fraud. March 23, 2021 by Anna von Reitz. Text-to-voice synthesis provided by Vidnami. The spellbinding effect of the fraud and confusion is self-evident as indoctrination, the many assumptions that we all consciously and unconsciously embrace as a means to navigate day to day. In this country, many people assume that they are Americans and some form of U.S. citizen at the same time. We routinely accept such things as daylight savings time. We stand in lines. We answer police questions. We endorse checks without limitations. We skip over the details of history, if we pay attention to history at all. We are all so busy just dealing with life, paying bills, working, trying to raise families, that the shortest line between point A and point B and the simplest possible explanation always seems to be the preferable answer, even if it's not the right answer. Many people are trying to recapture the funds that were raised by bonding their name and monetizing it, without realizing that securitization of living flesh is a crime, and without realizing that for them, those bonds are not profits. They are debts that unlawfully convert free men and women into indentured servants. The profit from this illegal trade, which is a form of human trafficking, was long ago eaten up by the perpetrators and expediters, the Depository Trust Company Corporation, which securitized the birth certificate associated with your birth event and issued the bonds, the Bank of New York Mellon which received the funds from the bond sales, the Vatican Bank which took its cut off the top, the Bank of Canada which took the Queen's cut, before returning the rest of the plunder to the Federal Reserve banks, which they then loaned out under the fraud of fractional reserve banking to create, and attach, even more debt to the phony municipal corporation, which was also constructed under conditions of fraud and used to stand for you as a public slave. Don't seek after the rewards of crime against you. It only makes you an accomplice and beneficiary of those crimes. Rather, stand against them for what they are, acts of self-interested fraud and breach of trust. Don't believe in the existence of these things, and they have no choice but to disappear, upon your demand. The simple maxim of law is that fraud vitiates everything it touches. The first fraud was to presume that you were a territorial U.S. citizen. The second fraud was to securitize and bond your name as such, unlawfully converting you, an American, into a British territorial citizen and indentured bondservant owned by the British Crown. The third fraud was to impersonate you as a municipal citizen of the United States, thus unlawfully converting your proper name a second time, to create municipal citizens, corporations of various kinds, owned and operated in your name by the verminous oligarchs running the municipal government of Washington, D.C. It's all fraud against you, first to last and top to bottom. So don't bother mucking around, learning all the excuses the perpetrators have offered for this circumstance, their breach of trust, their flagrant criminality, any of it. There are no excuses. Don't get tangled up trying to administer their legal fictions for them, pretending, or agreeing, to be the executor of your own estate, or similar efforts. All that does is get you into closer proximity to the skunks and their gigantic sting operation. And what smells like a skunk can too easily be mistaken for a skunk, even when you are just making an honest mistake and trying to haul your chestnuts out of their firestorm of debt and dishonesty. They took advantage of their positions of trust to unjustly enrich themselves. They created public trusts for the purpose of pillaging them. They unlawfully converted the natural political status of millions of Americans to do this. All the corporations they created are forfeit to the actual people whose names and identities were abused to promote this unimaginably large bunco scheme. And this is true on a worldwide basis, whether the banks and securities corporations like it, or whether they don't. Fraud vitiates everything, wipes even the most solemn contracts and treaties away, as if they never existed. Everything associated with fraud is null and void, as the Italians say, ab initio, from the initiation. So, as it turns out, Constantine did not grant the lands and holdings of the Western Roman Empire to the Roman Catholic Church. And that excuse for claiming the existence of Commonwealth interests related to the former Roman Empire goes right out the window. Goodbye to the Holy Roman Empire, and good riddance to bad rubbish. So, as it turns out, King George arrogantly contracted with the American Indians via treaties, that he subsequently evaded and dishonored with the collusion of his cousin, George Washington. Notice that the name, George, is common as dirt in that family, and means farmer, as in one who farms others, uses us as livestock, and profits by our death and dismemberment. There were plenty of good and earnest patriots who suffered and died in the Revolution, fully believing in freedom and brotherhood and the justice of what they fought for. There were also cads and scam artists and bad actors who profited themselves and their own schemes on the backs of those patriots, and so we find that King George's evasion of his treaties with the natives became the driving force behind these less savory elements and their pursuit of the War of Independence. It was only later, in the grips of what was supposed to be a brief salubrious war of political convenience, culminating in a resounding victory for King George III against the Americans, of course, that George Washington apparently realized that this was his chance to set up an American kingdom. So while he started out doing damage to his old foes, the Delawares, Lenape, Micmacs, and Iroquois, George Washington turned out to be a triple-crossing rat, converting a war of political convenience into an actual war, and then, later, selling out America's control of her international interests back to the British Crown. There is a reason that the Washington Monument is a giant phallic symbol. My point to all of you is that we are best served by exposing the fraud and the criminality of the abuse we have suffered, so as to rouse the conscience of our fellow man and create the inescapable awareness of the political pundits, plus all those bureaucrats and private law enforcement personnel they have been using to plunder and pillage the very people they are under contract to protect. Our job is to deny them plausible deniability, expose the fraud, and enforce the public law, remembering always that fraud is fraud, and piracy is piracy, and studiously avoiding stepping in either pile.